I'm Spencer Levy, and this is the Weekly Take. Coming up on this episode, we're drilling down into some dramatic business news that's been overshadowed by other crises in the headlines. We're talking about oil.
What's been going on is unprecedented. We went from a world of normal oil prices to a complete collapse at a degree that had never been seen before.
That's Dan Yergin, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and one of the world's foremost experts on the energy industry, whose forthcoming book is The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations.
I mean, what people need to realize is it's oil, but it's energy, but it's power, transportation, lights, and it also has to do with what used to be referred to as following the drill bit.
And that's Craig Beyer, a 35-year veteran of the real estate business and a leader in CBRE's global energy practice. Oil and real estate, who's driving? That's next on the Weekly Take. This is the Weekly Take, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Yergin, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 3 books, including The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power, and his new book, The New Map: Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dan joins us from his home in Washington, D.C. And I'm also delighted to be joined by CBRE's Vice Chairman, Craig Beyer, who is based in Houston, but calling us today from Big Sky Country in Whitefish, Montana. Dan, Craig, welcome.
Thank you. Great to join you and Craig on the Weekly Take this week.
Thank you. And Dan, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you.
You know, ever since we started this podcast 2 months ago, I wanted to have an episode focusing on the oil business because there's so much turmoil in the industry right now. And yet the timing of the current oil crisis in mid-March means that the story of what's happening there has been overshadowed by the pandemic. But there's a lot more to it than just cheap gas, and it's really going unnoticed by the general public. Dan, bring us up to speed. What's been going on in the oil business?
What's been going on is unprecedented. We went from a world of normal oil prices to a complete collapse at a degree that had never been seen before. Negative prices, minus $37 a barrel, and we've now seen a recovery. And all of that has happened in almost warp time while we've been in this COVID crisis.
Let's talk about that in terms of the history of oil and real estate. So, Dan, in your terrific Pulitzer Prize-winning books, you talk in great length about the history of oil. But when I was reading the book, I also saw the history of real estate, from Henry Flagler and his development of Florida, to the development of Los Angeles, to the development of Texas. Dan, could you just talk for a moment about the history of oil and how it might apply to real estate?
History of oil applies in so many different ways. First, of course, the development of cities, but it's also, of course, the development of transportation, the suburbs, the ability for people to move around. So history of real estate in many ways does mirror what's happened in terms of how we use energy and in particular oil.
Well, I think kind of picking up on what Dan said, I mean, what people need to realize is it's oil, but it's energy, but it's power, transportation, lights, and it also has to do with what used to be referred to as following the drill bit, right? So you have these areas that Dan's talking about, like London, Paris, Houston, Texas, et cetera, that were, heavily populated areas, but you still had to get to where it was, right? So you have all these other infrastructures that got set up. And so as all that developed, it developed into a spoke and hub situation for, the oil and gas business, which is still there today.
How do you think COVID changes the transportation equation and where people work?
I think COVID both increases the use of the car and decreases the use of the car. I think it increases it because there's going to be a preference for people to drive as opposed to public transport, to drive as opposed to flying. But at the same time, I think, and it may be more desire to work in the suburbs and drive to work. On the other hand, you also have telecommuting, which has become a really important part of, experience that's come out of this. And I think that we will see people, a question of how much time people spend working from home. And so we're really going to see a competition between electrons and molecules in terms of how people connect with other people in terms of doing their business and living their lives.
Let's pull the lens back a little bit, being a little bit more global for a second here. And let's talk about alternative energy. A lot of world economies and their entire solvency of many countries is dependent upon a price of oil being above a certain break point. Dan, do you see the shift away from oil as a good thing or a bad thing for these types of economies?
I think those economies need to diversify so that they're not so vulnerable to what are the cycles of the markets. There have been cycles in the past and there'll be cycles in the future. And so more balanced economies are very important for those countries to be able to benefit from the upside of the cycle and not be hit so hard by the downside.
Are we headed for a carbon-free world?
No, we're not headed for a carbon-free world anytime soon. The European Union and various countries have set net zero carbon as a target, but that's a very big reach to achieve that. Net zero means that you'll still have carbon, but you'll be able to capture it through natural plants, through technology and so forth. So there's going to be a push in that direction, but there are 276 million automobiles in the United States today. Those cars aren't going anywhere. The average car in the United States stays on the road for 11.8 years.
Let me give you a wild what if. Cold fusion becomes attainable tomorrow, soon thereafter. What happens to the world economy?
Well, I think the world economy is so big. It was $90 trillion before this crisis. So you're not going to change that overnight, but there will be new innovations. Just as I should add one other thing, whatever the price of oil is today, it won't be that price a year and a half from now.
So, Craig, let's talk about geopolitics and real estate demand. How do you advise your clients to take into consideration some of these global events when coming down to just very basic real estate needs in markets like Houston?
Well, in markets like Houston, I mean, what you have to remember is these people all understand all these geopolitical issues. We're talking to them as much as they're talking to us. But I think what it's really going to come down to is where can they operate the safest, most efficiently, and where can they make the most money? When you take, this rebalance of energy around the world, which you're also going to have to pay attention to is the cost of living and tax structures of these various places, because that's going to come into play as to where people go and work.
In reading your new book, Dan, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, I certainly am interested in your point of view of what's changed in your point of view because of the COVID crisis in terms of the clash for resources.
I looked at it in more geopolitical terms. First, it was really how the development of U.S. shale has really changed many maps in the United States in terms of where we get our energy supplies, but also changed the maps of geopolitics. I spent time in India, and I can see our whole relationship with India has changed because we're now supplying them with energy. There's a whole foundation to what previously was a rather difficult relationship. It's something where the Russians feel very competitive. The Chinese want to buy U.S. energy as part of the trade relationship. On the other hand, we also see clash of nations. We see the relationship with the U.S. has already gone sour with Russia, and we see it changing fast with China. And that has a lot of implications for the world economy, including for real estate, if you just think about some parts of the world. So geopolitics and energy go together, and together they affect other things.
Let's turn this conversation just a touch away from the global picture to the domestic one here in the U.S., specifically about an issue that's come up on just about all of our podcasts, is that the CBD, the Central Business District versus suburbs. And oil was essential to the rise of the suburbs 100 years ago with the automobile. But now what we're seeing is people are afraid of getting on mass transit, or many people are concerned about mass transit. And with the combination of that, with low-priced oil, do we see the suburbs now shifting to be more important than the CBDs today? What do you think, Dan?
Spencer, I feel like turning that question around because we're looking to you all and your colleagues for wisdom on that. I think every company is now, I've done a number of interviews with CEOs of major companies, and they're all learning from this experience. I hear CEOs say 25% will continue to work at home. people are going to have a preference to be in their car if they have a choice between that and mass transit, or if they have a choice between that and a short-range air flight. And in some ways, it suggests that, but again, you guys are the expert on that, that will we see a shift back towards a more suburban dispersed rather than a central city? I don't know. Spencer, what do you think?
Well, I'm glad you asked me on my podcast. I think you're going to definitely see it in the short term. I think the short term is clearly, we're already seeing that shift. I know for a fact from speaking with my colleagues, we're seeing a significant rise of what we call TIMs, tenants in market in the suburban areas. And we think that's going to last for the next 12 to 18 months. We're also seeing some people renting houses in these suburban areas as well. But let me turn to yet another real estate expert, Craig. Do you see not only your colleagues, but your companies that you represent moving out to the suburbs?
We don't see anybody really doing anything of consequence right now other than it's really more the focus of getting through the COVID issue and simultaneously looking at the retooling of the energy business. And a number of the energy companies are what are called essential services, believe it or not. And so there's been a big push by them to just get back to work. Do I think that long term it's going to change some things? Absolutely. But, this is not just about Houston. It's about New York City, it's about Chicago, it's about LA, it's about a number of them. And what I think is going to come into play is the geographic constraints of the cities with what's been developed and not, as well as how dependent they are on mass transit and how social behavior is going to react to that. It's interesting, if you look at Houston, we have plenty of land to grow. There's no shortage of suburbs. We certainly have what may have been considered to be a subpar mass transit system, but we still have a CBD that is served by buses, and we've got some train systems that are going into place. But by and large, if companies decide that they want to, spread out a little bit, not have their people so subjected to everybody as a choice, I do think you're going to see some of the Sun Belt and the Midwest areas expand.
Let me dig into that for a little bit and I'll be direct but polite. I've often been concerned about Texas because of its lack of rail infrastructure. Are we now saying that in the long term, or certainly in the short term, that the fact that it's a driving culture is a competitive advantage for Texas and Houston and other markets like it? Craig?
Well, I think the jury's still out on that. I mean, I think if you polled people today, they would say absolutely yes. Now, what happens if and when there's a vaccine? Are people going to wait for the vaccine? That's, to me, that's still the question.
So, Dan, let me go back to you for a moment here. Do we see any long-term innovation happening to transportation because of the COVID crisis, and how might oil play a part in it, using history as a guide?
I think the COVID crisis really does favor the car as opposed to mass transit. And until, as you say, there's a vaccine, I mean, think 4 months ago, no one would have expected we'd all be working at home and, and the lockdowns. So we still don't know if there's going to be a second wave of the virus or not, what the timing is of a vaccine and getting it out. So I think, to use Craig's thing, I think the jury's still out on a lot of things. Part of the innovation is in how companies organize and manage their lives. Technically, I think the question goes back to the pace of the introduction of the electric car. And the automakers, particularly in Europe, are under a lot of pressure because of regulations from the European Union and countries to reduce CO2. And the way to do that is to get more electric cars into the fleet. What they don't know is, are governments going to have the money, after all the money they've had to spend dealing with this crisis, to subsidize the rapid entry of electric cars, or is it going to be something that's going to be slower? So, I think in a sense, we're still in the middle of it. It's still, these questions aren't answered. And the other question is, of course, telecommuting, electrons instead of molecules. How will that affect work patterns?
Craig, let me ask you one more question. Right now is not such a terrific time for many of our younger professionals who haven't seen cycles, who haven't seen the price of oil collapse. What advice would you give to younger professionals today that are dealing with what might be their first crisis?
Well, I think I'd start by making sure they understand, but this is not the first crisis. This happens all the time. It happens periodically, and we always come back, and it's the ones that learn from the cycle, take advantage of the time to really get out and expand your business horizons and learn about the businesses that we're in that are going to be the ones that move ahead. And it's not just Houston and energy. It's how does energy affect Philadelphia, Chicago, Rio, London, because we're all affected by this. And those that understand this business are going to be the ones that make it.
Great. So Dan and Craig, on behalf of the Weekly Take, thank you for today's terrific discussion about the oil business and how it applies to real estate. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Dan.
For more information, go to CBRE/The Weekly Take. Until next time, I'm Spencer Levy. Be smart, be safe, be well.